growing up into my adolescence, I had a bit of a mantra, what was, I don't care about nothing or no one because nothing or no one cares about me. And that was how I lived day-to-day life, particularly in my chosen career of crime and drug dealing. It was only in my late 20s that I discovered anger and aggression are two different things. They're two separate entities. So I had spent most of my life, if I got angry, I would get aggressive. And it was through counseling, self-searching, reflection, and Jesus that I really learned how to channel those energies.
Welcome, Claude. It's so lovely to have you here.
Hiya, Patrick. Thanks so much for having me.
So tell us a little bit about the environment that you were brought up in.
Yeah, I grew up in a very tough environment, a very dysfunctional home with domestic violence. And at some points there were 7 of us living in a 2-bedroom house in which I slept under the stairs.
Wow.
And it was a very turbulent time growing up for me.
I remember that you first held a gun when you were 6 years old, you told me. You said it possessed power. Tell us a bit, what was that like? That is just almost mind-blowing for a lot of people.
Yeah, I had my oldest brother at the time was very much into crime, and he would bring objects and items back to the house and explain stories and tell us how he got them and things like that. And one day in the back room, my siblings, I've got 5 other siblings, and my siblings was huddled in the back room, and they was all whispering about something. So I went down to explore what was going on. And at the time I was very young, so I was just following my intrigue. And I found them all stood in a circle, passing something around and talking about it. And it happened to be a gun that my oldest brother had brought back to the house. And everybody took turns to hold it.
Wow.
And I waited apprehensively for my go. And eventually, the gun got handed to me, and even at that younger age of 6, I remember I was surprised by how cold the gun was and how weighty it was. And I remember thinking, even at that younger age, how powerful it seemed. I knew clearly it wasn't a toy. And that was really one of the most impactful moments of my life, the day I held that gun.
Wow. And I guess you talked a bit about the upbringing in the sense of the domestic violence, the sleeping under the stairs, it was almost like it's anxiety inducing, right? Particularly as you're growing up, because you're trying to form who you are.
Yeah. And
did any anxiety start to manifest, that sense of being on edge the whole time, not knowing what to expect?
Yeah, absolutely. I spent what feels like my whole life just swimming and drowning in trauma. And into my teens, I very much became very anxious quickly, paranoid. At home wasn't a safe place. It was like we were constantly walking on eggshells because of my dad's anger and aggression. And yeah, like I said, into my teens, by the time I was 16, I was carrying a knife and selling cannabis. And it sort of goes hand in hand from there, really. By the time I was 20, I was selling Class A's. And by the time I was 25, I could get access or get hold of any drug or firearm which I chose to, really.
Yeah. And I remember when we were talking, you said that you moved out of London. And it was at that point that actually adding into all those pressures that you're going on, which is almost like it's hitting you from every side, suddenly the sense of racial injustice suddenly was really there in your face as well.
Yeah. Unfortunately, at a young age, in my early teens, our house got repossessed and we moved up to Surrey, where back then Surrey seemed like very much country. And I was one of 3 individuals in my school that was a minority, that was a person of colour. And for the first time in my life, although I was from a multicultural background, I encountered racism firsthand. And I'd never experienced that before. And all sorts of things would happen. The 3 of us, myself and the 2 others in the all-boys school, we'd get targeted. You had to quickly find your feet and protect yourself and stand your ground, and those who didn't.
You feel like you had to harden up almost, or?
Yeah, instantly. Overnight. And it was just, even after school and in the area, if people saw me out and about, I'd get targeted. They'd throw things out of car windows at me and stuff. And obviously, shout things out as they drove by.
I know when we were talking, you talked about the difference between, which was really helpful, I think. You talked about knowing the difference between culture and colour, and how you sort of navigate through that.
Yeah, I think it's really important to establish that. Just one example, knife crime at the moment we know is an epidemic within the UK, particularly London, which is terrible. But it's important to highlight that knife crime isn't a colour, it's a culture.
Yeah.
And if we say gang member, the first thing that often comes to mind is an individual that's a closer skin tone to myself than to yours.
Yeah.
And again, that's just an example that it's not a colour, it's a culture.
Yeah.
And we have a culture of gangs and knife crime in London at the moment, and we need to forget about colour and focus on the culture.
Yeah, and I know because during my career that I've done a lot of work in terms of working in the inner city, and I know, for instance, I did a lot of research on gangs. In Glasgow, the gangs will be predominantly white on some estates because that is, the geography of that particular area. And so you're so right that we need to really stop stereotyping. Yeah. And I think the other thing I found, that a bunch of young people hanging out on the street corner, we might call them a gang, but actually they're just a bunch of young people hanging out on the street corner, right? They're doing what young people always do.
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely, I was never in a gang, but going back a few years now, my friend circle, my social circle would have definitely been described as a gang.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about anger and aggression. I sort of feel like we don't preach on anger much in the church, apart from Jesus and the Money Changers, right?
You're right.
And that comes out once or twice a year. But actually, anger tells you something is wrong. There's a sense of injustice to anger. And I know in Ecclesiastes it talks about don't let anger become a resident, but let it be a visitor.
Right.
And given all the stuff that's happened to you during your childhood, you must have felt incredibly angry a lot of the time, which was the natural way to feel. But how did you process that anger, I guess?
Sure. Growing up into my adolescence, I had a bit of a mantra, I don't care about nothing or no one because nothing or no one cares about me. And that was how I lived day-to-day life, particularly in my chosen career of crime and drug dealing. It was only in my late 20s that I discovered anger and aggression are two different things. They're two separate entities. So I'd spent most of my life, if I got angry, I would get aggressive. And it was through counselling, self-searching, reflection, and Jesus that I really learned how to channel those energies and when to channel them.
Yeah. And what were your coping mechanisms? Because I guess we all respond differently to pain. We all respond differently to when stuff's chucked at us. So how did you respond?
BC, I had the mentality that it was them or me. So
Right.
it was me against the world. That was my mindset for 17 years, day in, day out. And that's how I'd handle it. Obviously, I hadn't encountered grace at that point and the love of Jesus, so my self-worth and value lied elsewhere.
I remember you saying to me that you felt like at that time your whole lifestyle was about hiding. What did you mean by that?
Yeah. I felt like I just spent my life hiding. I was either hiding from the police or hiding my drugs from the police or hiding from other criminals, or eventually I felt like I was hiding from myself and hiding from the world, society.
Yeah. Now, through all the stuff that you've been through, there seems to be a real cry to belong. I was been saying a lot. There's in Bouncing Forwards, the book I wrote. There's a big difference between fitting in and belonging, and that belonging though is so crucial. It's so crucial to many of our guests. But it seems that it was real heart that you just wanted to belong.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Bouncing Forwards really it captures that beautifully. And I think that resonates with me in regards to just my whole life. I just felt like an outsider, just excluded from school, excluded from socially from people of my peer group who was already going to university. When my friends were going to uni, or my school friends, I was selling Class A's. At 19, I was buying vehicles, which is nothing to be proud of. But I just never found the belonging.
until faith came in. Now tell me how did that work? Because obviously you've got this chaotic lifestyle, you've got this craving to belong in, this craving to be part of something, and I guess, you know, how did you engage with faith? How did you even start to think that way?
Growing up, my dad being Jamaican and my mum English, we always had some sort of idea of God or a God, but I didn't know Jesus, you know. And it was later on in life when I was mentoring young offenders for the council, which I used as an opportunity for a bit of an alibi, if you will, that I had an opportunity. I met with a Christian. We were doing a team building day. He was actually my manager at the council, and he was the manager of that borough of the council. And we all went along, whether you was a volunteer or a full-time worker, we all had to go along for this team building day. And one by one, everybody took turns to stand up and do an icebreaker. So you would introduce yourself and you would say one thing that nobody else knew about you. And I always say it's a silly example, but there was a lady there called Susan who stood up in front of, you know, I don't know, 100 people and said, "My name's Susan, and what nobody knows about me is every day after work I buy a bar of chocolate and eat it on the bus on the way home." And then the next term was my manager, and he was a really introvert chap, real grounded, humble guy, full of humility. And every day in the office, I'd go in and I'd have these expensive jeans on and expensive trainers, and he would come in. Nobody would say hello to me or morning to me. And he'd come in and say, "Hello, Claude, how are you?" And at first, I don't know if it got my back up a little bit, because I thought, why is he bold enough to engage with me, you know? And then we got to talking, and over lunchtime, there I was, full of ego and pride. I would invite everybody to the restaurant down by the river. And he would politely decline because he had bought a packed lunch to work. And I would park one of my cars, my convertible, outside the office window for everybody to see, obviously.
Just to say hello.
Just to say hello. And he would cycle in to work. So really humble, grounded guy. So when it come to doing the icebreaker, I thought, what's this chap going to say, you know? He might tell everybody he plays chess or something. We'll see. And then he stood up and he was bold. And he introduced himself, and you know, there I was in my 350-pound jeans, and he had his plimsolls and chinos on, just a humble chap. And he got a little box out of his pocket, and he opened it up, and he said, "What nobody knows about me is," and he lifted a crucifix high into the sky, and he said, "I'm a Christian, and Jesus changed my life."
Wow.
Yeah, and at that moment, I was really struck by it. And I couldn't even tell you the rest of what he said because I was so struck. I just knew right there and then I needed to find out more. And when he finished, I quickly went over to him and asked him if I could give him a lift because he had to leave, and he politely declined the lift. And I asked him again and again till eventually he accepted. And on the way to the train station, I asked him how I could find out more about what he said. And because I'd lived, you know, I conquered a lot. And I've been through a lot, and I've put a lot of value in things that I shouldn't have, but I never felt the encouragement that chap had felt. Where did he get his boldness from? And he said I should try an Alpha course. So I rushed home, looked online, and an Alpha course was starting the next day. So I enrolled on the Alpha course.
Wow, fantastic. And then I guess there's a point where that you just realised that you're loved.
Yeah.
That I think that, and then the love of God, like, you know, I say, we can do so much for people, and it's good to do that, but there's the love of God transforms someone's heart and the way they feel about themselves. And I guess through that Alpha course, there was that sense of, oh my goodness, I'm loved.
Yeah, I it gives me goosebumps to talk about it, but I remember the week I got to invite Jesus into my life. I remember I dared Jesus, you know,
I love that phrase, you dared Jesus. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, in my voice of thought, I said, Jesus, you know, if you could do what these people are saying you could do, I dare you to come into my life. You know, I dare you to make a change, do something.
Yeah.
And mate, it was so silent, you could feel it, you know. And it felt like I had my eyes closed forever, but it was only for a moment. And I felt a movement. I felt a movement in me. And I never knew what it was at the time, but Jesus had come into my life. And at the end of that session, I couldn't wait for next week. You know, the week seemed too long. And like you said, I went along to the rest of the course. And week by week, I discovered more about Jesus. And I remember I began reading the Gospel of John. Someone gave me a pamphlet because I was full of questions. And one verse that particularly stood out for me is it says, if they hated you, it's because they hated me first. And I remember thinking, mate, I've been to battle, you know. And I never heard of a God that was against the odds like I'd been against the odds in life. So I was intrigued to read more. And I got my hands on a Bible and I didn't put it down for a lot of weeks. And I fell in love with Jesus, head over heels. And I've been in pursuit ever since. And that's where, like you said, my value and self-worth comes from.
Yeah. Given everything you've been through, I'm conscious that when you do come to faith, it's not like suddenly everything is dealt with. I think sometimes we see prayer as a bit of a magic wand. You know, I've seen people like, God just sat me and it's all be dealt with and there's no hardship anymore. But actually dealing with trauma is huge, isn't it? I mean, I was writing about, I wrote a chapter called Going Back to Go Forward, and how trauma is stored in our bodies. I know that I've spent a lot of time in hospital, and every time I go in the hospital, my heart starts to race. And logically, I could tell myself I need to be in hospital for a blood test or an X-ray or whatever, but it affects my body. Presumably, given all the stuff that you'd been through, that dealing with trauma and understanding trauma was really crucial to you.
Yeah, I think what isn't said often enough is sometimes the healing hurts more than the wound.
Wow.
And I had a lot of healing to do. And of course, I would find ways to support that, whether it was through food, alcohol, partying, you name it. But now, thank God, I'm on the mend. You know, it's a daily renewal. But yeah, trauma can be drowning. Mental health is definitely an issue for people today, in today's day and age, particularly males. But trauma
Not many males talk about it, that's the challenge, right?
That's the problem. And the thing is that everybody's going through it. You know, especially in my background, if I may just take a moment to highlight, I don't know an individual that hasn't suffered from some sort of mental health issues or depression, particularly elders or olders, as the youngsters would say. I know too many individuals that's been hospitalized due to mental health, sectioned, because they have a lack of stability mentally. Psychology is important, but it's not really elaborated or highlighted in our community, because you're considered weak if you tell someone you're not feeling well. You know, if someone, in my day, you couldn't even compliment somebody because they considered that as a weak suggestion. So we were raised to be like this. But it's really important that individuals, particularly young males from my background and similar, understand the importance of positive mental health. If you don't feel well, I would say tell somebody. Yeah.
And of course, in the church, we've got to create a culture where you can be, you know, say it's okay not to be okay.
Yes.
At times. And as Christians, it doesn't mean this stuff doesn't affect us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a great point, Patrick, because Christianity isn't a quick fix. And like you said, it's okay not to be okay. We're all broken one way or another. Everybody's in church for a reason. Everybody's longing for God for a reason. So just know that you're not on your own.
So tell us a bit about how you cope with pain now. I mean, obviously back then you coped with pain through drugs and through violence, and now pain hasn't gone away, but you've got this faith. It doesn't mean everything is suddenly perfect, but how do you cope now?
Yeah, saving me from myself is a daily task, but Jesus does it anyway. Thankfully, grace is an amazing thing. I can't believe I went nearly 30 years without knowing what grace ever was. So now I take time. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. So I take time to reflect on my issues. I spend a lot of time outdoors in the countryside. I'm a huge fan of gardening.
You love gardening, don't you?
Mate, I'm green-fingered, honestly, bro. Yeah, honestly, it's
It's
mad
great though,
one.
isn't it? Because you're in the moment when you're doing the gardening,
You're
right?
so present. It's a beautiful feeling. So I love the outdoors. And when I feel hurt, I'm not trying to hurt anyone else, because before that was transference.
Right.
So I would make my issue become someone else's issue.
Yeah. So what does resilience look like now to you?
Resilience, that's a great question. I think resilience looks like recovery.
Right.
I think we pick up the pieces, you know, and we glue the bowl together or the pot together. And it doesn't look quite how it did before, but it's still usable, it's still going, and in many cases is even more valuable than it previously was. So I love your definition. And I think that's what resilience looks like.
Yeah. So you've written this book,
Yes.
which is, I'm so chuffed that you put your story down. It's going to be so helpful to so many people. Tell us a bit about it. What's it called?
Thanks, Patrick. The book's called Guns to God. It's my story. It highlights the two life-changing moments in my life, like we talked about when I was a boy and I held that gun, and when I was an adult and I met Jesus, and how they both changed my life. And you could just read more about it in the book. It's Guns to God.
So looking back, and people ask me this question quite a lot. If you could talk to your younger self and give your younger self a bit of advice, what would you say to your younger self?
Yeah, that's a big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I would really like to relay that don't let everybody use you except God. God will use you if you want to be used. You know, don't serve everybody else and not God. And I just tell my younger self that you're loved. You're loved beyond your wildest imagination. You're valuable, you know. And I would really suggest that anybody get to know Jesus in a way of which they never thought they could.
Yeah.
Just really lean in and just see for yourself.
Did you feel like the Jesus that, I guess, you experienced as a child in terms of, you know, I don't know, sometimes we go to Sunday school and there's an image of Jesus who feels distant, far removed, often blonde and blue-eyed, and to the Jesus that can feel anxiety, understand suicidal thoughts, understand depression, there was quite a difference, isn't it, from the first Jesus to the second Jesus? Yeah. And actually, I think a lot of people be watching this go, well, my experience of Jesus is definitely the first one.
Yeah.
You're talking about something really different.
Yeah. That's excellent. Jesus was the outcast. He was cast out. He was downtrodden, you know, exited to exile. That's the Jesus I know and love, and whom loves me. And, you know, I often try to share the message that it's not about the insiders and the outsiders. It's about bringing the outsiders inside us, because it's about what's inside us. And that's the Jesus we need to get to know. The heart,